All right, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Agroforestry workshop. So my name is Chang. I'll be chairing today's workshop. We have 90 people registered, but I guess sometimes people's schedule change, and so I don't know how many we are going to end up with attending. And we have at least 4 different countries represented. I see quite a few registration from the United States, some from India, and a few from China, and quite a few provinces represented from Canada. I guess we have to stay positive, test negative, right? With the benefit of the pandemic, we are able to track attendance from across the country, across the globe. That's nice. And I guess usually as a housekeeping item, I have to tell you where the washroom is and where the emergency exit is. I don't have to do that anymore. And we're not going to have a break. We're going to have a 2.5-hour program. So if you need to have a bar break, feel free to do that on your own. Well, for today, you receive the email response as you register for the workshop, but I will really quickly go over the agenda for today. So again, it's about a 2.5-hour program. I will be speaking after this slide to provide you with a project overview. And after that, we'll have Edward Bork to speak to you on definitions of agroforestry systems. After Edward, I'm going to come back to provide a summary of findings from our first phase of the program. And then Carl Grass is going to talk to you about some of the main findings from the second phase of the project. Most of the presentations are going to be focused on findings from the second phase of the project. So after Carl, we have Zhengfeng An to speak to you about enzyme activities in the system we studied. And then Carlyle is going to speak to you about carbon storage, particularly in vegetation, but I understand he's going to provide some global view on carbon storage in agroforestry systems as well. Then Edward Bork is going to come back to speak to us on some of the scaling work that we are doing. And Edward is also going to spend 5 minutes to wrap up this workshop. We'll have about 40 minutes for questions and answers, but if we don't get to your questions before that, feel free to stay on. I believe the speakers will be available even beyond 11:45. So my name is, again, Chang. I'm a professor in the Department of Renewable Resources. For the next 10 minutes or so, maybe 8 minutes left, I'll be providing an overview of our agroforestry program here at the University of Alberta. I have the rest of the 4 speakers, the pictures listed here as well. So again, Edward Bork, Carlyle, Carl Grass, and Zhengfeng An. You'll meet them today as they speak to you on the various topics. First of all, I would like to fairly quickly thank the funder. The project was funded by Agriculture, Ag-Food Canada through the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Program, the AGGP program. And also would like to thank the partners for this program, namely Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and Agroforestry and Water Extension Society within the province of Alberta. Well, the first question as a project overview I would like to answer is, why did we do this program, which includes 2 different phases or two different projects? And obviously, the overall motivation is that agriculture globally, as well as in Canada, is a really large source of greenhouse gases, or GHGs, in the atmosphere. So looking at the global level, we can see that agriculture, forestry, and land use constitutes about 18.4% of the global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Within this agriculture sector, as you can see, livestock and manure, agriculture soil emissions, rice cultivation, crop burning, deforestation, and cropland. Not exactly sure what that exactly is, but these are the categories of greenhouse gas emissions contributing to agriculture and forestry and land uses in a global level. So perhaps keep in mind the details of the entries for this greenhouse gas accounting at the global level. In the Canadian situation, the estimate is that agriculture contributes about 8%. And obviously the accounting is quite different. Here in the Canadian, 8%, some estimates up to 10% of contribution from agriculture in Canada, including methane emissions from livestock, soil management, managing livestock manure, as well as the use of fertilizers as sources of contribution in agriculture. So since agriculture is a really major source of greenhouse gas emissions or contributions to the climate change issue, obviously there is a lot we can do to help to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. So the overall motivation for this project is to develop best management practices or BMPs, including land use systems, to try to increase carbon sequestration in the agricultural landscape, as well as to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is coming from Google Earth, a picture representing land use just south of Edmonton. And you can see that there's a mosaic of land uses in this agricultural landscape. The majority of the land here obviously has been converted to agricultural annual crop production systems, but we do see some forested or treed land use still exists in this agricultural landscape. And that I'll come back, or Edward will come back to talk about these different land use systems in agroforestry systems in particular. So I won't dwell too much on that. But the key thing that we have to understand here is that in terms of greenhouse gases, we have to think about the sources, and globally we can think the sources to be mainly from fossil fuel burning, as well as agriculture and forestry, here being represented by land use change or deforestation. And these greenhouse gases coming from these sources, they have to go somewhere. The majority of them, unfortunately, end up in the atmosphere, and that's contributing to the increased greenhouse gas concentrations, represented by carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. Luckily, 31% is estimated to go into terrestrial ecosystems. So the terrestrial ecosystem is a carbon sink, as well as the ocean. Obviously, all of us, the presenters, are working in terrestrial ecosystems, so we can't really do much about ocean. So the driving factor here is then, or what's driving our interest in doing this project, is to see how we can increase carbon sequestration in the terrestrial ecosystems. So with that, the agroforestry program was lucky enough to get 2 grants from the federal government. The first grant, I call this as a phase 1, funded our research program between 2011 and 2015. We studied carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions in planted shelter belts, natural hedgerows, and silvopasture systems in central Alberta. And this grant was funded to me and Edward Bork. We had, at the time, was MP in Edmonton Centre. Laurie Horn came to the campus to make the announcement about this funding. The objectives for this project, or the phase 1, were to demonstrate the potential benefit of agroforestry, or AF systems. You might see this abbreviation again later on in this presentation, to provide ecological services, including carbon sequestration and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, agroforestry systems have a range of other ecological services as well, but our research has been focused on these two aspects of agriculture systems, ecological services. And hopefully with data coming from this research, we should be able to provide input to future policy development on what sort of waste management practices we should be promoting, and so forth. So obviously in this program, we tested 3 BMPs, so waste management practices, including shelter belt system, hedgerow system, as well as the silviculture system. Again, Ed will talk about these different agriculture systems in more detail in his presentation that's going to follow mine. So within this program, we trained several highly qualified personnel, or HQPs, including Cam. Luckily, Cam only worked in this project for a few months. He landed assistant professor position at the UA. Then we had Sam Banaji, Fala Fatami, Samson Lim, Mark Ba Kimfo as a PhD student, and Chitington as an MSc student. We also had a number of research assistants work on this project. We were able to publish 8 papers out of this 4-year research project, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, but including publications ranging from looking at microbial respiration to greenhouse emissions during spring thaw, to a literature review paper looking at the entire question of agriculture systems in their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, and so forth. So the other 4 publications here as well. If anyone is interested in receiving a copy of any of those publications, let me know. We can send a copy of those to you. And the second phase, or the second project, funded our research program between 2017 and 2021, which ended in March just last month. Here, the title of our project is Waste Management Practices, or BMPs, to enhance carbon sequestration and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture systems. At the time, the Minister for Agriculture and Ag Food, his name is Lawrence McAuley, came to the campus to make the announcement here as well. And this project, we had Cam came on board as a PI here as well. The objectives for this project had the following 3. Number 1 is to further assess the potential to use shelter belt and hedgerow systems to enhance carbon sequestration, which is similar to what we did in the first phase of the program. The second objective, which is fairly new, is to investigate the effect of enhancement planting on carbon sequestration. And I'll spend just a few 20 seconds to introduce or to define enhancement planting. As we can see in this system, we have a gap here, and this obviously will cause the system to lose its functionality, and we were thinking to plant these gaps with trees so that we have an intact agriculture system. And we wanted to see if we do that enhancement planting, what might be the impact on carbon sequestration, including greenhouse gas emissions as well. And in the agricultural annual cropping systems, we then designed a treatment where we were looking at the effect of manure compost as compared to the manure compost biochar application on soil carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions. We thought in the agriculture production system, based on our finding from the first phase, it's a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, much greater than in forest land use in agriculture systems. So we thought there must be BMPs that we can design to help to change that situation. So the BMPs tested in the second phase, including the 2 agriculture systems, as well as the enhancement planting, as well as the application of manure biochar. And we have a large number of HQPs that we trained on this project as well. not being able to go through the names individually, and also the number of publications. We have some still under preparation, and it's getting pretty much ready for submission. We have one under review or under revision, and hopefully will be accepted for publication. And we have 4 others already being published, and our estimate is more than 5 papers will be prepared and submit for publications. Again, those that have already been published, they are available. And let me know if you're interested in those. So that's the end of my presentation. We have Edward Bork speaking to us about agroforestry systems and what are the common agroforestry systems, particularly in Western Canada. Ed.
Great, thanks, Scott. Good morning, everyone. So my screen is good, everything's fine?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Scott has asked me to give a very brief kind of introduction to the different agroforestry systems. He also talked a little bit about what those are already. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap, but I'm going to maybe add a little bit more clarity. So this is going to be a very brief overview or introduction to these agroforestry systems, mostly to make sure that we're all thinking about the same types of systems, that we visualized and contextualized, if you like, the specific agroforestry systems that we were examining throughout these 2 phases that Scott reviewed, phase 1 and phase 2. So, and I'm going to start out with a working definition of what an agroforestry system is. So it's basically the deliberate integration of woody vegetation. So it could be shrub cover, so tall shrubs, low shrubs, but generally we're usually talking about trees, at least here in Western Canada, and integrating that deliberately with some type of herbaceous vegetation. So it could be perennial grassland, or it could be annual cropland. And of course, Scott already showed you the picture that probably the annual cropland is the more prevalent type, at least within much of central Alberta. But I'm going to show you not just here, but later on, that there's very important carbon stocks associated with some of these other agroforestry systems. And so these can either be deliberately planted, as Scott was alluding to, or they can be naturally occurring. And in fact, I would argue that the naturally occurring woodlands that are present across much of central Alberta actually are the more common type of agroforestry system that we find. And the key component here is that by integrating different growth forms in a common production framework, we're able to get greater total production, which is a phenomena that we call over yielding. And it's due to what we call niche complementarity among different plant species having different growth forms. And so I just want to talk about this really briefly. So niche complementarity is basically the more efficient capture of both sunlight and also the uptake of soil nutrients and water. So all vegetation fundamentally needs nutrients, water, and light. And so by integrating these different growth forms, tall structured trees or tall shrubs, low shrubs, and then tall forbs and grasses, we're able to not only get a more diverse canopy structure above ground, which provides greater capture of sunlight, but also, if you think about what's going on among these different growth forms below ground, they all have different and somewhat complementary root systems. Some have these large fibrous root systems, some have tap roots. And so by putting together more of these growth forms, we're actually able to A, capture more sunlight, and B, take up more of the soil nutrients and water that are available. So that's what these agroforestry systems are fundamentally doing. So in a very general sense, agroforestry systems are very widely practiced globally. In fact, it's probably in parts of North America where we tend to maybe see trees as somewhat of a nuisance. But if you go to other parts of the world, these agroforestry systems are maybe the norm rather than the exception. And they can be loosely generalized into either boundary systems. So boundary systems would represent, as the name implies, where we have forest concentrated to either the edges of field as windbreaks, or use of living fences, which is quite common in the tropics, or even as riparian buffers. Alternatively, we can deliberately plant trees into some kind of plantation system, and we might have an integrated alley cropping system where you've either got a trees grown for production or a fruit crop or fiber combined with some kind of annual or perennial crop in between. Or we can have these fodder livestock production systems, which are generally silvopastoral systems, where we're combining trees with some kind of grazing and or forage production systems. So with that backdrop, I just want to review the different types of systems that we commonly have in Western Canada. So one of them is, as Scott referred to earlier, he mentioned the shelter belts. So these are deliberately planted areas with trees, and they're very commonly found as linear features, often at the edge of field margins. And so that makes them essentially one of these boundary systems where they're deliberately planted either as a single row or in some cases 2 rows or 3 rows, or under very rare circumstances 4 rows. And they can be comprised of 1 species or multiple species, 2 or 3 or 4 species even. So and it all depends on the individual making the decision of planting those trees. Really what we're trying to do with these shelter belts is we're trying to achieve wind protection, often for yard sites or for adjacent fields or livestock wintering areas. They're important for snow conservation or soil conservation by reducing winds and also trapping snow. So in areas where we might want to accumulate more moisture. And then of course they have significant aesthetic value as well. So that's one of the systems that we're looking at throughout these 2 research projects. Second one is natural hedgerows. And as the name implies, these are naturally regenerating or naturally occurring forests at the edges of fields. They're usually adjacent to cropland, but they don't have to be, because you can have pastures with an area that's basically ungrazed at the edge of the field or is subject to lighter grazing, where you might have this natural regeneration of trees. They are, again, a type of boundary system. They typically have very high diversity, both diversity in terms of structural diversity, because there's an overstory, a midstory, and then an understory. They also have high plant species diversity because they are composed of natural mixes of plant species. There's many different plant species growing together. They are dependent on intermittent tree regeneration in order to propagate themselves, which in the case of central Alberta often tends to be aspen or balsam poplar, which fortunately are very prolific and able to regenerate quite readily. They have similar to functions to shelter belts, as they are these boundary systems. And of course, they include providing wildlife habitat corridors. Okay, the third type of system, which actually, when you look at the aerial footprint, happens to be the most common one, at least in central Alberta, is a system that we call these silvopastures, which are inherently grasslands, so perennial grasslands intermixed as a mosaic across the landscape with different forest community types. So if you look at this aerial photo here, you'll see that there's this mixture of grasslands interspersed with generally aspen forest, but in some cases conifer, or you can get different shrublands as well, things like western snowberry or wolf willow, all intermixed. And of course, there's grazing within these systems. And so while we might often think of stereotypical grazing, especially by livestock, and cattle is the primary one in central Alberta anyways, while we might think of cattle utilizing these open grasslands for the most part, they don't limit their use only to these grasslands. They also graze the understory of these forests as well. So there's this mixed mosaic that are being grazed and essentially utilized by ranchers on a going forward basis for the forage that's in the open, but also what's in the understory. This is a relatively widespread agroforestry system within the Parkland and the Boreal region of Western Canada, not just Alberta, but Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well. Again, they're notorious for having very high vegetation diversity, not only in the understory of the forest, but also across the landscape because of this mixed mosaic. They provide a very high degree of environmental goods and services, which includes carbon storage, as you'll hear shortly, but also diversity, habitat diversity, and so on. There's a last agroforestry system type, which we can characterize as riparian forests. These are generally riparian areas, so areas with an elevated water table. They're usually located next to either a wet meadow or a dry meadow, and they're again often grazed by livestock. They are they're classified as their own type of agroforestry system. Having said that, we had a significant discussion at the very beginning of phase one of this project, whether we were going to include riparian forests. We decided not to, not because they're not important, but rather because it would introduce a whole new level of complexity into our assessment. So just be aware that this fourth type of agroforestry system exists. Okay, so with that, that wraps up my introduction, and I will turn it back to Scott.
So I'm going to be moving on to the next portion of my presentation to give you a fairly quick overview of the findings from our first phase of the project. So the main objective for this workshop is to share results from the second phase of our study, which again will have more presentations. But since the two phases of the project or the program were related, so I thought I would like to take this opportunity to give you a quick rundown of the key findings from our first phase of the project. And again, in the first phase of the project, we were focusing on the 3 different agroforestry systems. And again, the objectives were to demonstrate the potential benefit of agroforestry systems in providing ecological services, including carbon sequestration and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and to provide input to future policy development on BMPs, which was the objective of the AGGP funding. So for the first phase, the basic research approach was to study, again, the 3 different agroforestry systems. And for each agroforestry system, we selected 12 sites across a fairly wide area, just centered along Edmonton. So 270 kilometers north, south, and 226 kilometers east, west. The 36 sites were distributed across that wide landscape in central Alberta. Okay, this is a map of Canada, Alberta, and this is the area that we studied. In terms of the experimental design, we obviously had 3 different agroforestry systems, as Edward has introduced those to you. And so we were computing the different agroforestry systems. So within each agroforestry systems, we were looking at the total of the treed area and the adjacent agricultural production system. But within each agroforestry system, then we were comparing the treed area, whether it's shoulder belt or hedgerow or silvopasture, compared to the adjacent different agricultural land use. Okay, for shoulder belt and hedgerow, we were comparing to annual cropping system. For the silvopasture system, we were comparing to adjacent grazed pasture without trees. And the total of the annual crop system and the grazed pasture, we call that as a herbland, just for simplicity, when we compare the treed area versus the herbland. And so this is the basic sampling design. We obviously were sampling the soils within the treed area, within our agroforestry system, as well as in annual cropping or the herbland area. And within each of these land use systems, we did a transect, and along the transect, we sampled multiple points, and we then collected or formed a composite sample for the analysis in terms of soil carbon, different carbon fractions, as well as setting up plots for installment of greenhouse gas chambers for greenhouse gas measurement. And the first result I'm going to be sharing with you is about soil carbon. And this is a result coming from Mark's publications back, one of Mark's publications back in 2014. In this case, we were looking at carbon concentration in the 0 to 10 centimeter of the soil in both in the bulk soil as well as the different particle size fractions. So the fine fraction, the coarse fraction, the medium fraction, I'm not presenting any data, but it's really similar result. The result indicates that in terms of the carbon concentration, there was a greater carbon concentration in the forested soil as compared to the herbland soil, regardless whether we are looking at the bulk soil or the fine fraction or the coarse fraction. The distribution in the fine versus the coarse fraction is quite interesting, because if most of this carbon is distributed in the coarse fraction, then we would be somewhat in trouble, because the carbon associated with the coarse fraction is considered to be less stable or much easily mineralized and released as carbon dioxide through microbial decomposition. But obviously, the good news is that even in the fine fraction, we are seeing a higher concentration of organic carbon in the forest land use as compared to the agricultural land use or the herbland. So that is obviously fairly positive, that in the mineral soil, we see increased carbon concentration. And when we convert these carbon concentration and sampled all the way to 75 centimeters down from the surface of the mineral soil, to account for the effect of the fairly deep roots of the trees in the forest land use in agricultural systems, we see that in the forest land use, there was always, regardless of the agricultural system, there was always a lot more organic carbon being stored in the system, including quite a bit in the organic horizon. And I guess in the silvopasture system, we should have some LFH here as well in the grazed pasture, but I believe that in terms of the assessment, that has been unfortunately omitted, but it's not going to be as much as in the forest land use in this case. And so the trend is still clear that in the forest land use, in each of these agroforestry systems, there's a lot more organic carbon being stored. And that again is across 36 different sites. Well, the second data that I'm going to be sharing with you is about greenhouse gas emissions. And this is particularly during the spring thaw period. And for those of us who live in the northern latitudes, we are familiar with this type of thing. In the spring thaw, as the snow is melting, there will be water accumulation before the land would be suitable for seeding, for cropping, etc. So we suspect that in this field, in this period of the year, there will be a flush of greenhouse gas emissions, and so we needed to quantify how much greenhouse gas emissions may be occurring during the spring thaw. There was no difference whatsoever, whether it's among the different agricultural systems or between the two land uses in terms of the CO2 emission rate. The differences we saw was with N2O emission and CH4 methane emissions. But again, the methane emission here is, in fact, in most cases, is uptake or oxidation, where the mesonotrophes living in the soil will be taking up the methane or oxidizing them. And so this will be converted to carbon dioxide, reducing the greenhouse or the methane concentration in the atmosphere. So the results we found is that in the spring thaw period, the nitrous oxide emission rate, so we sampled in 2 years, in 2014 and 2015, there were differences. There were inter-annual variability, obviously, between differences between the two sampling years. But in 2014, there was no difference between the two land uses in silvopasture systems, but no difference in the shelter belt either. But in the hedgerow, there was a greater nitrous oxide emission in the herbland or in the annual cropping system. In 2015, there was no interaction between the agroforestry system and the land use, so we were only evaluating the main effects. And obviously, the nitrous oxide emission in 2015 during the spring thaw was much higher in the herbland than in the treat area in 2015. The methane data, essentially the take-home message is similar to the NTO emission rate. There was a greater uptake, which is obviously a good news in the forest land use. This is 2014, and in 2015, greater uptake in the forest land use in the shelter belt system, sorry, the hedgerow system and the shelter belt system without any difference between the two land uses in the silvopasture system. The third result I'm going to be sharing with you is also on greenhouse gas emissions, but this is coming from the summer. The key message is, again, with some exceptions or because of the interactions that we are seeing, the heterotrophic respiration or the microbial respiration, which contributes to the loss of organic carbon from the soil, was higher in the herbland than in the treat area. Okay, so that would be the key message. Again, there are differences across the sampling time in 2014, and there were interactions between the agroforestry system and the land use, but on average, or on the as a general trend, the microbial respiration rate was higher in the herbland than in the forest area. And as looking at the heterotrophic respiration as a proportion of the total respiration, which includes respiration by the plants themselves, the heterotrophic respiration was 59% of the total respiration in the herbland, while only 41% was heterotrophic respiration in the forest land use. Okay, so even though the total respiration can be higher in the forest land use, but because of the smaller proportion was coming from microbial respiration, which indicates that there was less organic carbon being lost from the forest land use in the growing season. The next two slides is about the nitrous oxide emission and the methane emission. Here, in terms of the nitrous oxide emission, the key message is that in the growing season, in the middle of the growing season, after the fertilizer application, we see a flash of nitrous oxide emission coming from the herbland because of the fertilizer application, while in the forest land use, there obviously was no fertilizer application. So that resulted in the greater nitrous oxide emission in both in 2013 and 2014. In terms of the methane uptake, as I mentioned earlier, methane was in the upland ecosystems typically was a oxidation process or uptake by the mesonotrophes, and that causes a reduction in the methane concentration near the soil surface. And again, regardless of 2013 or 2014, the forest land use had greater methane uptake because this has been presented as an uptake. So it's been presented as a positive value, and the greater the uptake, the better in terms of mitigation of climate change, okay? So some of the take-home messages from the first phase of the project are that land managed under forest or perennial grass vegetation was able to store much more carbon, so organic carbon, than the herbland, and therefore there is a benefit to promote tree planting or inclusion of trees in the agricultural landscape. The forested area emitted much less nitrous oxide and was a greater methane sink during the spring thaw. And so even during the spring thaw, having trees in the agricultural landscape helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in the summertime or in the main growing season, then the greenhouse gas emissions were obvious that the forest land use had a much lower heterotrophic respiration rate, had lower nitrous oxide emission rate, and had greater methane uptake in these land use, forest land use systems. So the overall message here is that there is a benefit to be realized in terms of increasing carbon sequestration, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the forest land use as compared to annual crop production systems or grazed pastures in this case. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope I gained a few minutes. We should probably move on to the next presentation and leaving the Q&A to the end so that we can stay on top of the schedule. Next, we have Cole Gross giving a presentation to as to what he found in the second phase, the main project of the second phase. And Cole is a PhD student in the program.
All right, hello everyone. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for participating. My name is Cole Gross, and this presentation will cover the main findings from phase 2 of the agroforestry and greenhouse gases project. The main topic of this part of the overall project is enhancing soil organic carbon storage through forested buffers and biochar application in agricultural lands. In Canada, over 65 million hectares of land are dedicated to agricultural use, and over 30% of Canada's agricultural land is in Alberta. Agricultural soils and their management contribute to about half of the national total agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. These greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to global warming. Agroforestry systems, which deliberately incorporate woody perennial vegetation into agricultural fields, can help increase carbon sequestration both above and below ground. Mixing organic additives into the soil can also increase soil organic carbon storage. Increasing soil organic carbon has many benefits for soil health. For example, increasing organic carbon in soils improves soil structure, as well as increases the water and nutrient holding capacities of the soil. This can increase crop yield and reduce erosion and runoff, among other ecological benefits. In this study, we specifically investigate the effects of manure compost and biochar produced by processing the manure compost at very high temperatures under low to no oxygen conditions. This comparison will ultimately allow us to assess the direct benefit or lack thereof of applying the biochar product of an organic feedstock versus applying the feedstock itself. My team and I conducted a 3-year field study in central Alberta, Canada, in 2 common types of agroforestry systems to assess soil organic carbon storage and greenhouse gas emissions. The 2 common types of agroforestry systems that we used were hedgerow, which consists of legacy perennial vegetation buffers that include a woody component, and shelter belts, which consist of planted woody perennial vegetation at field margins. So the shelter belts are typically a single species planted in a row of a one specific age. So we had 5 shelter belt systems and 5 hedgerow systems. In croplands, we compared manure compost and biochar applications with a control. Treatments were applied in early May of 2018, and they were tilled into the upper 10 centimeters of soil at equivalent carbon rates. So specifically, we applied 7 megagrams per hectare of carbon. The plots were randomized and 30 meters from trees or field margins. Throughout the presentation, the cropland control will be abbreviated as CT. The manure compost treatments will be abbreviated as MT, and the biochar treatments will be abbreviated as BT. And the cropland control will be yellow, the manure compost will be brown, and the biochar will be black. We also compared the cropland and adjacent perennial vegetated areas, either with or without a woody component. 10 Okanese poplar saplings were planted in one of the 2 non-woody perennial plots, in early June of 2018. Woody, non-woody, and planted subplots were selected randomly in representative perennial vegetated areas. To help the saplings establish, the surface soil was hand-tilled to 10 centimeters in depth, and we also applied mulching paper and watered the saplings every other week for the first 3 months. Again, the cropland control will be abbreviated as CT. The non-woody perennial vegetation will be -WT. The planted saplings will be abbreviated as PT, and the woody perennial vegetation as +WT. The cropland will still be represented as yellow, the non-woody perennial vegetation as light green, the planted saplings as blue, and the woody perennial vegetation as dark green. Greenhouse gas emission collection occurred every other week during the growing season. 2 gas collection chambers were used per plot, and collected gases were analyzed using a gas chromatograph equipped to measure carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which are the 3 main greenhouse gases emitted by soils. Or also, as Scott had reviewed previously, methane is often taken up by soils. So soil sample collection occurred by depth to 100 centimeters in May 2018 prior to treatment application, and again in May 2020. Soil samples were analyzed for organic carbon and nitrogen in various fractions, including dissolved in microbial, which were analyzed on a total organic carbon analyzer, and particulate and aggregates, which were analyzed on an elemental analyzer. Total carbon and nitrogen were calculated on a mass basis, meaning that we compared carbon and nitrogen within equivalent soil mass layers rather than fixed depths. And the reason for this is to overcome biases that are associated with soil surface disturbances in the agricultural land in particular, in the fields due to either compaction of the soil or tilling, which will disturb the surface and therefore change our fixed depths. So to overcome this, we analyzed the soil on equivalent soil mass layers. So these are the soil mass layers that we use that generally correlate with these depths. We also collected surface soil organic litter layer samples, and we collected soil moisture and temperature data every hour. Finally, we completed a vegetation survey, and we collected above ground biomass samples so that we could calculate the total crop yield, as well as calculate total ecosystem carbon storage. Although not all results will be covered in this presentation, future publications will fully explore all results and discuss their implications. So coming into the results now and starting with the cropland, manure, compost, and biochar additions to the cropland did not affect crop yield. Crop-related metrics had a high variation due to differences in crop type and annual precipitation. So no crop-related metrics measured were affected by treatment application. We do see a slight increase here in biochar application and biochar addition crop yield. However, this increase was not statistically significant. So the bars used in figures throughout the presentation represent an estimate of each group's mean. The statistical tests performed apply to the difference between the means, and significant differences are denoted with letters, different letters above the bars. Because the bars are an estimate of each group's mean, and the statistical tests apply to the difference between the means, bars may in fact overlap, even though the difference between the means is considered statistically significant at a 5% significance level. So moving into looking at the soil organic carbon in the cropland, no difference was found in soil organic carbon mass across treatments across the mass layers sampled. However, if we just look at the surface soil, which in this case is the upper two mass layers and correspond to a depth of approximately 0 to 16 centimeters, biochar addition did in fact increase organic carbon mass by 14 megagrams per hectare relative to the control. This suggests that biochar may have led to additional surface soil organic carbon sequestration, since this is about double the amount of carbon that we applied in 2018. We applied 7 megagrams per hectare, and in 2020, we found an increase of 14 megagrams per hectare in the biochar plots. However, this increase was offset in deeper soil layers, indicating that surface soil organic carbon increases due to organic additives cannot be viewed independently of potential effects on carbon cycling processes occurring deeper in the soil. Manure addition decreased soil microbial biomass carbon by an average of 18% across the two surface mass layers relative to the control in fall of 2020. Manure addition increased surface soil water-soluble organic carbon by an average of 11% across the two surface mass layers relative to biochar addition, again in fall of 2020. Manure compost addition increased average daily total greenhouse gas emissions by 29% relative to biochar addition and by about 20% relative to the control. Biochar addition had no significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions relative to the control. Greenhouse gas emissions were driven primarily by carbon dioxide emissions. However, in June of each year, we had a substantial flux of nitrous oxide following inorganic fertilization in the fields with seeding. In the cropland, greenhouse gas emissions were not strongly correlated with increased soil organic carbon and microbial biomass carbon. This suggests the carbon in the manure compost was more available to microorganisms than the carbon in the biochar, as evidenced by the increased water-soluble carbon from manure addition. This also suggests that the increased water-soluble carbon from manure addition may not have been contributing to microbial growth and was instead being respired as carbon dioxide inefficiently by the microorganisms. Overall, biochar application slightly increased crop production and slightly decreased greenhouse gas emissions and water-soluble carbon relative to the control, indicating potentially greater carbon inputs via roots and increased protection of those carbon inputs in the surface soil of the biochar addition, reducing carbon losses both via microbial decomposition and leaching. On the other hand, manure compost application substantially increased greenhouse gas emissions and did not significantly increase soil organic carbon relative to the control. Moving on to differences between land uses, perennial vegetation surface organic litter layer carbon mass had substantially greater carbon mass in the perennial vegetation versus the cropland. Now, this is expected because over time, the surface organic litter layer is able to build up in perennial vegetated areas, whereas in the cropland, the crops are harvested and any litter that is left tends to be tilled into the surface soil. Woody perennial vegetation litter layer carbon comprised approximately 3% of total soil organic carbon mass. Planted saplings had no effect on soil organic carbon relative to non-woody perennial vegetation. Woody perennial vegetation contained an average of 16 megagrams per hectare more organic carbon than the cropland across the soil mass layers, an increase of 42% organic carbon mass to approximately 100 centimeters in depth. However, if we look at the cumulative soil organic carbon to approximately 100 centimeters in depth and do not compare the individual soil mass, the combined effect of the soil mass layers, we do not see a significant difference. And this is due to the high variation in these soils. Hedgerow woody perennial vegetation had 142% greater soil microbial biomass carbon relative to the cropland, and 72% greater soil microbial biomass carbon relative to the hedgerow non-woody perennial vegetation. Woody perennial vegetation had 41% greater water-soluble organic carbon relative to cropland and non-woody perennial vegetation. Hedgerow woody perennial vegetation had 86% greater average daily greenhouse gas emissions relative to hedgerow cropland, and 70% greater average daily greenhouse gas emissions relative to the shelter belt woody perennial vegetation. So if we look at what's going on year by year with these greenhouse gas emissions, we are looking at 2018, 2019, and 2020, and these are the hedgerow sites, and these are the shelter belt sites. So we can see in general that we have an increase of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 and 2020. This increase appears to be slightly greater for the hedgerow systems as compared to the shelter belt. Now with the shelter belt, we don't see a large differentiation between the fluxes between the different land uses. However, in the hedgerow in 2019 in particular, we see that the hedgerow woody perennial vegetation has much higher greenhouse gas emissions on average daily than the cropland in the hedgerow. So in 2019, perennial vegetation in general had 62% greater average daily greenhouse gas emissions relative to the cropland. So across land uses, greenhouse gas emissions were strongly correlated with increased soil organic carbon, water soluble organic carbon, and especially microbial biomass carbon, which of course are producing the majority of these, or are producing the greenhouse gases that we are interested in. Greenhouse gas emissions were also strongly correlated with precipitation and soil moisture content. Although hedgerow woody perennial vegetation increased greenhouse gas emissions, this may be due to site-specific factors such as flooding. Furthermore, in our study, carbon dioxide emitted by roots, referred to as autotrophic respiration, was also captured during our greenhouse gas collection from chambers in the field. And this is included in the greenhouse gas emission figures in this presentation. To truly understand soil organic carbon cycling dynamics across the systems and land uses, autotrophic respiration will need to be distinguished from microbial respiration, which is the emission of carbon dioxide from the decomposition of soil organic carbon. This heterotrophic respiration is what we are interested in, because this is the decomposition of soil organic carbon and the release of that carbon into the atmosphere. Because perennial vegetation allocates more carbon below ground, we expect autotrophic respiration to be greater under perennial vegetation relative to cropland. Overall, further investigation is needed and is forthcoming to understand carbon cycling and compare total carbon stock differences across the systems and land uses studied here, particularly in relation to the greenhouse gas emissions across land uses. In summary, our preliminary results indicate that the application of biochar rather than its manure compost precursor, increased surface soil organic carbon sequestration. The manure compost, on the other hand, increased greenhouse gas emissions, but did not increase soil organic carbon relative to the control. Established woody perennial vegetation contributes substantially to both above and below ground carbon sequestration. Cropland biochar application and agroforestry systems should be incentivized as viable climate change mitigation agricultural practices. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who has helped on this project over the years. It's been a challenging but rewarding 4-year project, and it would not have been possible without all of the people who have been helping over the years. We would also very much like to thank the landowners and farmers who have generously and patiently worked with us over these years. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Cole, for keeping on time. And we are moving on to Zhengfeng for giving his talk on enzyme activities and how they are affected by manure compost and biochar applications. Zhengfeng is a PhD student in the program as well. And I guess I didn't have time to go through the details. Both Cole and Zhengfeng have been supported by very prestigious scholarships. So we were really lucky to have them working in the project. Zhengfeng.
Yeah, is my PowerPoint okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Zhengfeng An, currently a PhD student with Scott. Today, I'm going to talk about the effects of manure compost and manure biochar application on soil carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus-related enzyme activities. Soil enzyme activity is very important because it can act as soil quality indicator, and it responds rapidly to agriculture practices, closely linked to nutrient availability, and most importantly, they involved in the process of greenhouse gas emissions and will give us implications for greenhouse gas mitigation. Manure compost and biochar had been advocated as amendments to increase soil organic carbon stock, as well as influencing the greenhouse gas emissions. However, how will manure compost and manure biochar will increase the nutrient availability and enzyme activity still need to be studied to get an overall picture of how will those amendments affect greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, in this study, we are going to investigate the effects of manure compost and its biochar addition treatments on soil carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus-related enzyme activities, and then study the relative carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus limitation and different treatments to combine those information, which will give us implications about greenhouse gas emissions and different treatments. We utilized the 10 agriculture sites, all sites located in Central Alberta. Actually, this study was a small part of the phase 2 of HGP. And we used a randomized complete block design with 3 7x7 meter plots at each site. Soil samples were collected monthly from May to October in 2020. At each plot, one complete soil sample was from 6 points from 0 to 10 centimeter. And we analyzed the following properties, like soil total phosphorus and available phosphorus, soil ammonium and nitrate, soil hot water extractable organic carbon and nitrogen. Those belong to the labile soil carbon and nitrogen pools. So to understand the enzyme activities, we selected 5 different types of enzymes. They are carbon cycling related, like glucosidase and soil biosidase, and nitrogen cycling related, like referred to LAP and AIG respectively. And we also studied acid phosphatase to look into the phosphorus immobilization in the and different treatments. We also use the two vector factors to represent the relativity of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus limitation and different treatments. The larger the vector length, the higher the carbon limitation, while when the vector angles less than 45 degrees, it means relative nitrogen limitation, while when the vector angles higher than larger than 45 degrees, which means phosphorus limitation. Here are the results. First, all treatments had a similar total phosphorus, available phosphorus, and phosphorus-related enzyme activities. There's a slight increase of available phosphorus of applying biochar, and however, applying biochar and manure systems reduce the acid phosphatase, but this reduction was not statistically different among treatments. And manure biochar treatment reduced the soil ammonium content. Also, there's a slightly reduction of nitrate content when applying biochar, which would give us implication of the manure biochar application likely reduce the substrate for nitrogen-related greenhouse gas processes, which would be useful for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And also, manure biochar increase the hot water extractable organic nitrogen, while do not affect the hot water extractable organic carbon. The hot water extractable organic nitrogen was significantly higher relative to the control when applying biochar, which means that biochar treatment increases the nitrogen retention, which is good for soil nutrient availability and quality. And meanwhile, manure compost increased the NIG enzyme activities relative to the control, which also explains that's the reason why there is an increased greenhouse gas like nitrous oxide emissions in the manure treatment. While for LAP enzyme activities, there was no significant difference of biochar amendment or manure amendment relative to the control. And both manure compost and manure biochar had no influence on carbon-related enzyme activities relative to the control. And for the microbial carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus limitation, we found that all treatments had a similar soil microbial carbon limitation and no phosphorus limitation. And while all treatments had a soil micro nitrogen limitation, and manure biochar increased the nitrogen limitation compared with the manure compost, this would give us implication about adding biochar will reduce the nitrogen-related greenhouse gas emissions. Here are our summary. First, manure compost and manure biochar amendments changed the soil ammonium, hot water extractable organic nitrogen, nitrogen-related enzyme activities, and microbial nitrogen limitation. Manure biochar increased the microbial nitrogen limitation compared with the manure compost, which is useful to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is the preliminary results of my current work, and we will combine all the greenhouse gas emission data in 2020 and and data like soil moisture, precipitation, and aim to get an overall picture of which factors affect greenhouse gas emissions. And those results will be showed on consequent publishing. Thanks very much.
Great, Zhengfeng. Thank you again for keeping on time. And we actually gained a couple of minutes from Zhengfeng's presentation. So we're going to move on to the next presentation. Again, for those of you who have questions, you can start to type into the chat box.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be speaking about the trees and the vegetation in these systems. We have collected this data within this project, looking at the various we've collected extensive data on the vegetation in these systems, but the analysis on that isn't quite together yet. So for the most part in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on some review analyses that we've completed. Okay, so just a very quick reminder that there's carbon in the atmosphere, and vegetation is the conduit that through the dropping of vegetation and through root exudates that moves that carbon into the system. And so some of the things that we were wondering about what's going on within these systems with respect to the vegetation is, just how much carbon is being stored in the vegetation of these agroforestry systems. And then secondly, and maybe more importantly, are there strategies that we can use in terms of the vegetation to try and enhance the amount of carbon that's stored in the entire system? And so just as a reminder, just to break it down where carbon is sitting, the vast majority of the carbon is sitting in the soil, and then about a third of it is sitting in the vegetation, most of it in above ground vegetation, and some of it in the roots. These numbers are coming from a review paper that Mark Baugh did looking at agroforestry systems across Canada. The root number is probably a little bit of a underestimate because of the difficulties associated with sampling roots and especially sampling them to their full depth. There was a question about treed versus untreed areas. And sort of what we've seen, if you have an area like this where there are no trees, if it's perennial, the amount of carbon in the soil is more or less similar to what is in the soil underneath the trees. So that's what we saw in our silvopastoral systems. But of course, you're missing the large amount of biomass that's held in the trees themselves. And so we did divvy up the above ground biomass into different components. And so what you can see here with these numbers is, so we estimated the amount of carbon sitting in trees and the different layers of vegetation within those systems. And the vast majority of the plant biomass is indeed sitting in the trees when we look at the areas where trees are present. If you compare to the previous slide, these numbers are a little bit different, just simply because they're coming from two different data sets. This is from our own sampling. So we have these agroforestry systems. Most of the biomass is in the trees. And then I just want to touch on one other sort of piece of background, is that there is variation among tree species. So this is one of the papers that Mark had included in his review. This is just a sample of the data that came from this paper by Witherspoon, looking at different tree species in alley cropping systems in Ontario. Sort of one of the few papers that we came across that actually measured both above ground biomass carbon and soil carbon. And so the things to take away from here is just that across these three different species, we see, a doubling in terms of the amount of above ground plant biomass. And then there also appears to be this relationship between the amount of biomass and increasing amounts of soil carbon. And so this goes back to our original sort of question, what is the relationship between the biomass and the trees that we have in these systems and the amount of carbon in the entire system? And so the way we looked at this, this is work that was done by Zhilong Ma, who was a postdoc on the project and who is now in a faculty position at another institution. He did a meta-analysis where he looked at the data from other published papers, and you can see, this includes a fair amount of data, 509 comparisons coming from 141 different papers, and these were distributed around the entire globe. Some from North America, Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia. So a fairly global representation of agroforestry systems, and the amount of, and then he looked at the amount of carbon in the biomass and in soils. And so I'll highlight some of the patterns that came out of this analysis. So the first thing is that if we look here at this figure is showing the relationship between the amount of biomass produced in the vegetation each year and the amount of change in the soil organic carbon over the age of the system. We see this positive relationship. So systems that are growing faster in terms of their vegetation increase their amount of soil organic carbon faster as well, and add more carbon into the system. So, that leads us to the idea that, anything that we can do to help increase the amount of plant and tree biomass is going to be beneficial for the overall carbon in the system. Then the next thing that Zilong looked at was just, what was the composition of those agroforestry systems, and looking at the number of different tree species that were in them. And so he simply compared systems that were monocultures, like what we see in this photo here, where all the tree species are the same, versus systems that had at least just two different tree species in it. And what you can see here is that had a substantial impact, increase on the amount of carbon stored in the system. So having a diversity in terms of tree species leads to more carbon. The reason for that, it goes back to what Edward was saying earlier on about just that niche partitioning within the system, where when you have trees with different architecture, they're able to capture more sunlight and be more productive. So when we have more than one species, we end up with more biomass carbon. And then the other thing that came out of that is that pattern continues through time. And so in the top figure here, if you look at the pink line, that is showing that biomass carbon increases at a faster rate when there's more than one species versus a monoculture system. And that, this pattern persists, over a long time period. So at the bottom, the accumulation rates of biomass carbon, continued well into the future when there's more than one species in the system. So having multiple species is probably going to be beneficial for overall carbon accumulation. And then also looking at patterns through time, we looked at the relationship between the change in the amount of soil organic carbon across the different ecosystems in the world, so tropical, arid, temperate, and boreal systems. And the thing to take away from here is that the temperate zones, the pink line here, they continued to add carbon into the system for a much longer time than other locations in the world. It took about 35 years for these systems to reach equilibrium. We see that reflected in the figure at the bottom here. Again, just highlighting that, young stands add carbon pretty rapidly because there's new, faster tree growth. But the pattern that we saw with the pink bar here is that temperate systems tended to maintain that higher rate of soil organic carbon increases in their later years. And so this is important because a lot of policy is based around 20-year time windows. And so we need to think about aligning those two timeframes and making sure that they make sense. And then just the last important result that I think came out of this paper was a comparison of if these agroforestry systems were planted into areas that had previously been cropland versus whether or not they had previously been pasture. What we're seeing here is that adding trees into cropland systems, has a definite impact. It increases the amount of soil organic carbon in those systems, whereas adding trees into systems that had previously been pasture didn't have a benefit, and even maybe had a negative impact on the overall soil organic carbon amount, although it wasn't significantly different from zero. And so the important thing to note, though, is that the amount of biomass carbon, so the amount of biomass in trees in the cropland and the pasture didn't differ, but just, there was no real increase in the amount of carbon into those pasture systems, probably because they were already close to equilibrium, whereas the cropland systems had already lost their carbon, and so they had potential to rebuild the carbon back into their soils. And so important implications here in terms of, where do we actually add these systems into our landscape, and so cultivated areas would be the key candidates. Okay, and just to quickly re-summarize everything I just said. So we see that agroforestry systems globally lead to increases in the amount of carbon being stored, so they're a good general strategy. Even though the amount of biomass carbon, the amount of carbon in the vegetation is relatively small, it can have, the amount of it is important because it tends to lead to more carbon being stored in soils and increasing the overall amount of carbon stored in the system. From a general strategy, multi-species planting is probably a good bet if we want to increase the amount of carbon faster and put more carbon into the system. We should be aware that some of the time frames where we see equilibrium in terms of carbon sequestration happening in these systems is maybe taking longer than what some of our current policy is assuming. And then finally, agroforestry in croplands is probably going to be beneficial, but not in areas where perennial vegetation has been present previously. Thank you.
Great, Cam. I guess we lost a few minutes and we'll quickly move on to Bork again. Your kind of last presentation.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Better make sure I muted myself. Yep. Okay, so I guess I have the privilege of being kind of the cleanup hitter here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the very last component that we've been working on. There's many of us involved in this, and I guess this is in a part kind of a roll-up because it does involve some spatial scaling or looking at what the footprint of agroforestry systems is across at least central Alberta. And I want to acknowledge Zhengfeng in particular, who really has been the lead in doing, I guess, a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of bringing the data together and so on. And I just happen to be the messenger here. So I really want to thank him for doing a lot of the work. Okay, so some of the key questions I just want to address here is first and foremost, and I guess the way to think about it is I'm going to give you a snapshot of present and then also talk a little bit about past and also about future. And so we can phrase this around three different questions. One of them is, what is the carbon storage associated with the footprint of existing agroforests? So if you think about what's out there right now at this point in time. Another way to look at this is to go backwards and say, if we look at the dynamics of forest changes, specifically forest lost, what have we actually lost in terms of carbon stock? So I'll give you an answer to that as well. And then I'll also ask the question, if we actually were proactive and we were to promote, for example, further forest establishment in the form of shelter belts, we can also answer the question, to what extent could carbon storage be enhanced by enhancing or increasing these shelter belt plantings across central Alberta? So that's kind of the present, past, and future perspective. So just a few brief comments on the methods. So again, Zhengfeng was critical in this and has really led this. This is the area we're looking at. It's basically from west of Edmonton to the Saskatchewan border, and from roughly Red Deer north to basically the boreal forest. So you think up to about Barhead and Athabasca, Smoky Lake, and so on. And so we're looking at a total area somewhere around 9.5 million hectares is the agricultural footprint within that area. And so what Zhengfeng did is really randomly select 50 plots, and these were large plots, 3 by 7 kilometers, totaling about 0.1 million hectares in area, and then went in using imagery and then mapped out very specifically the spatial extent of each of the different types that we have within there, either shelter belts, hedgerows, or silval pastures, those 3 focal areas that we were concentrating on throughout a lot of this work. And then we took some of the phase 1 results, which, if you recall, it documented the shelter belt, hedgerow, and silval pastoral carbon stock, and specifically results that were reported by Liminal in 2018, and applied this spatial data or the formulas that we got out of the detailed field studies to the spatial data in order to look at how much carbon is out there, assuming, of course, that those 50 plots are representative of the broader agroecological system across that central region of Alberta. And just to give you an idea, excuse me, of what the carbon stocks were that we were utilizing for this evaluation, the hedgerows, shelter belt, and silval pastoral forests are generally containing much higher total carbon stock. So that's everything, including the vegetation, the LFH or surface mulch, and also including what's below ground down to 1 meter. That's in comparison to the grassland and cropland. And it's largely because of that added biomass carbon that's in roots and the stems and so on in these multi-tiered layers above ground. And then we also identified the potential of expanded shelter belt plantings to affect carbon stock. And the way we did that is basically tally up all the area along the roadsides, especially adjacent to cropland. So if we made the decision to plant all of that to trees, what would that actually change in, let's say, 50 or 80 years' time, using some of the information, for example, that Cam presented on how long does it take these temperate forests to reach their equilibrium? What could we realistically expect in terms of enhanced carbon storage? So it's a bit of a modeling exercise. There's a spatial component here, and it's also linking to our field data. Okay, so if we look at these 50 plots, and remember these were big plots, 3 by 7 kilometers, they're distributed all over central Alberta. Cropland represented the largest area of agricultural use. So almost half of the land base was in cropland. The silval pastures were also very significant. And they included, because remember that there's an area of grassland in there, but there's also an area of forest. So when you combine that, it's roughly 38% or pushing 38% within those plots. In contrast, the hedgerows and shelter belts comprised only a very small fraction of these landscapes. Excuse me. The hedgerows actually occupied only 1.3%, and the shelter belts 0.3%. And I'm sure all of us who are familiar with this region that have driven around central Alberta, or even anywhere in the Western Canada, kind of in that parkland type habitat or zone, are very familiar with that shelter belts. Really, yeah, you do see them, but they don't represent a very big footprint in the landscape. And that's what this is really confirming, followed by hedgerows, but then these silval pastures that are quite common. Sorry. Okay, so when we look at the total length of these linear features in the landscape, the hedgerows and shelter belts actually occupied a total linear length of almost 1,200 kilometers. So again, that's just within these 50 plots. The agroforestry systems contained a disproportionately large amount of carbon stock. And I want to point that out down here. So I created this table to basically just summarize. And I think the most important information in here is if you compare the percent of the total agricultural land area within those 50 plots compared to the percent of the carbon stock within the same area. So if you look at shelter belts, for example, they only represented 0.3% of the area, but they actually contained 0.5% of the total carbon stock. Similarly, the hedgerows represented only 1.5% of the area, aggregate area, but they contained 2.3% of the total carbon stock. So what it means is that these agroforestry systems, especially the forests, are actually disproportionately storing a larger share of carbon across the entire landscape. That's the way to think about it. And the silvopasture forests, that number really jumps because we're looking at 21% of the ag land area, and yet it contained almost 33% of the total carbon stock. The exact opposite pattern was represented by the grassland and the cropland, particularly the cropland. Even though the cropland represented 54% of the ag land area. So this is the ag land area. It's excluding urban, industrial, and water, and so on. In terms of the total carbon stock, those cultivated croplands only comprised 46%. So they're underrepresenting the total carbon storage, if you like, at the landscape level. That's the way to think about it. And the other thing that we can do is if we compare the contribution of the shelter belts, hedgerows, and the silvoforests to what the adjacent land areas represent using those formulas I gave you earlier. So roughly 370 tons of carbon per hectare as opposed to 190, we can calculate the incremental value of the carbon that's contained within these forests. And it is not trivial. In fact, it's over $5,000 a hectare. That's using this $30 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent valuation. Okay, so if we were to extrapolate this, and I realize there's a bit of a leap of faith here, but if we extrapolate this to the entire 9.5 million hectares that we find in central Alberta, we can do this similar type of calculation. These three agroforestry systems contained almost 700 million tons of carbon. So this is million tons of carbon. And the total linear length is now projected out to almost 107,000 kilometers, okay? Now that seems like a lot, but remember we're talking about 9.5 million hectares of land. So it's a really large land area. And again, if we do this calculation, so these numbers are all the same, but we now extrapolate it across the 9.5 million hectares, we can calculate roughly what this carbon is worth, and it's quite shocking. In fact, you'll see that using that $30 ton valuation, the value of that carbon across the larger region is somewhere around $10 billion. That's 10 billion with a B. The lion's share of which, of course, is located within the silvopastures, because that is by far and away the larger land use, at least among the three agroforestry systems that we actually looked at. So there's a lot of carbon that's tied up out there and is contained within those agroforestry systems. So that's looking at what we've got out there now. Let's look backwards. So Zhengfeng also pulled up data from the last 20 years. So this is remotely sensed data, so aerial imagery, and was able to map out rates of forest loss. So this graph on the left here basically maps out the extent, the amount of annual forest loss. So in some years it was only around, fairly modest, around 1,000 or a little less than that, 770 hectares per year. But in the years when crop prices might have been really high, we lost a lot more forest, over 5,000 hectares per year. And the total over that 20-year period was almost 50,000 hectares. So that's an aggregate kind of metric of forest loss within this area. And so what that represents is these areas would be cleared, bulldozed, burned, plowed under, and converted into something else, usually annual cropland. And so if we now look at the annual carbon loss associated with that land use conversion from this loss of forestry over time, or these forests trickling out of the landscape because of land use conversion, we basically arrive at a mean annual carbon loss of somewhere around 0.4 million tons annually. And that's not trivial. So you might not see it as a pronounced effect in any one year, but added up over many years, it starts to add up. And if you add that up across the hedgerow and the silvopastoral forest types, so those are the two more common types, we basically have undergone a loss of somewhere around 8.5 million tons of carbon over the last 20 years in central Alberta. And if we further, again, add that $30 valuation per ton of carbon, that represents somewhere around $250 million of carbon that's been lost because of conversion of hedgerow and silvopastures into some other land use. So these are not trivial numbers when you think about carbon offsets and carbon valuation. That's a lot of carbon that we're losing from these systems, and it should, in theory, have very high valuation. So the last thing that we did is we looked forward and we said, well, what if we were to have a policy that would reward landowners for planting all of these lands adjacent to roadsides that's in cropland, at least the perimeter, to create these boundary conditions, boundary agroforestry types, where we now have these systems much more abundant across the entire region. Well, this could potentially grow the area of shelter belts by somewhere around 46,000 linear kilometers. And over time, again, that doesn't occur overnight or even in 1 year or even in 10 years. It might take 60 or 80 years. But over time, this would increase carbon stocks by around 22 million tons. And again, if we add that $30 valuation, that would represent somewhere around $650 million of carbon that's sequestered within those shelter belts over time. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the scaling. Scott has also asked me to give a big picture takeaway. And so I've tried to pull all this together, everything you've heard from everyone in these different talks, into some summary points. And so here we go. So first and foremost, that agroforests are an underutilized, and unfortunately, they're also a declining land use activity, as I just showed you, across central Alberta, and where they're largely being replaced by cropping. It's being driven by market economics, especially crop commodity prices and so on. There is significant potential to increase carbon stocks, both in the soil, but also in the vegetation component, because there's so much carbon stored within the tree biomass itself. And there's potential for expanding agroforestry systems and therefore increasing those carbon stocks. As a society and as significant land users out there, I think there's an opportunity here to promote really the conservation of existing agroforests and also increase agroforests, for example, shelter belts over time. So both of these are significant opportunities. Those agroforests store large amounts of carbon that unfortunately at this point remain unvalued by the carbon market. And I think this is a really important point. And that's where really we're striving to get to. We're trying to point out the size of the carbon pool that's stored within these systems and the role of agroforestry in potentially combating climate change, as Scott talked about at the outset. And so if we know the size of that pool and the value of that pool, hopefully we will have policy changes that enable and encourage landowners to change their behavior to either conserve agroforests or even increase the abundance of agroforests, whether it's through shelter belts or otherwise. And these changes would then have trickle-down effects in increasing revenue streams for landowners, while also having all kinds of spillover effects in, for example, enhancing biodiversity and providing wildlife habitat and so on. So a lot of other things that are also, unfortunately, unvalued at the present time. So that's kind of the big picture takeaway message that I hope everyone got from what they heard today. Again, we want to just thank the AGGP program from Agriculture Canada for funding. This work would not have been possible. As Scott outlined, there were 2 major grants that were funded to make all of this work happen. A lot of different landowners we need to thank for providing site access and cooperating with us. And they put up with a lot because we're going in, we're doing these treatments, we're putting in these chambers in order to do our greenhouse gas assessments, and then we'd have to pull them out and reinstall them. So they put up with a lot, and we really, really thank their cooperation. Many graduate students, postdocs, and summer students, and Scott did a great job highlighting just how many people have been involved. This has been very much a team effort. And there's lots of literature, both scientific literature, but also extension publications. And so we've got the website up there for anyone that's interested. And of course, you can also reach out to any of the investigators here, and I'm sure you'll get more information. And with that, I think that's what we've got. And we have time for questions and discussion. So May had asked whether it's the trees or the herbaceous component under the trees that was responsible for storing carbon. I think Cam answered that, but there may be a lingering question on that. May, did you have any clarification or follow up on that?
No, I was going to say between you and Cameron, you answered the question very well with the concept of the niche complementarity and also the true data that you found.
Okay, great. And then Sheila Nolan did ask a question about, is the added biochar supporting nutrient transfer to plants, or is it inert or possibly retaining nutrients? So Cole, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this case, biochar has been shown to help support aggregate stability in the soil. So it helps with basically binding soil particles together and organic matter together. And it also helps with protecting carbon via mineral adsorption. So in this case, you wouldn't say that it was necessarily inert, but it is actually causing a greater protection of the organic carbon and the nutrients that are bound up in that organic carbon. It is actually protecting it to some degree from microbes and microbial respiration, which is why we didn't see an increase in greenhouse gases and maybe a little bit of a decrease. So in that sense, it is actually protecting these nutrients. So I would not go to say that it's actually necessarily limiting or causing a limitation to the nutrient acquisition of plants and yield. As we saw, there was even a slight increase in yield in the biochar. But that is something that we would take into account, that for sure it is actually helping to protect the organic carbon better from the microorganisms. And it's the microorganisms working on that organic carbon and breaking it down that actually releases nutrients to the plants. But unless if you really apply way too much biochar, more than probably would ever be practically applied, I don't think that you would end up causing limitations of nutrients to your plants. But that's certainly something we would have to explore with rates of applications, which is actually getting into Chris's question, which is the next question there, which is our rates of applications. So we applied 7 megagrams per hectare of carbon, equivalently with the biochar and the manure compost. The manure compost was applied at 25 megagrams per hectare, and the biochar was applied at 20 megagrams per hectare. And this is so that they had equivalent carbon rates. So this was a generally practical application, which is what we tried to base it after. But I do think for sure that if you do change those application rates, particularly in a substantial way, that you could certainly see differences in greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon dynamics going on in that soil. So I think I wouldn't say that you could extrapolate too much beyond the rates that we used in this study to say our results would be representative of all different application rates. So I think that there would certainly be some amount of effect by applying a different rate of these treatments. We tried to go with something that would be practically reasonable and applied by farmers and landowners. And yeah, if there's any follow-up from Sheila or Chris, I'm happy to field your questions, as I'm sure others are as well.
There was a question from May also about what comprised the other. That was in the pie chart that I presented. So I believe that is because that's within the 50 plots. That would be areas that would have fallen out of the analysis because they were roads, urban industrial development, yard sites, excluding shelter belts around yard sites, obviously, water bodies and so on. But Zhengfeng, do you want to follow up on that as well? And I think May had also asked about the riparian forests. And to my knowledge, we did not include that. So that might be lumped in there as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, we actually we do not look into the riparian area because we based on different special sources and in QGIS so that we can identify where there is potential water body. So we can we just avoid to include too many factors because our focus is shelter belt, hydro, and soil pasture. And if you can, there might be very interesting to include the riparian forest. It might be involved in future work. Thanks. And for other questions.
Are those all the questions?
Well, there was a comment here from Brenda in Camrose County regarding that when they reconstruct roads, so I assume when they high grade roads, that inevitably they usually just wipe out and obliterate the trees, and that's what's done in my county as well, northeast of Edmonton, and it usually is. I totally agree. It is a battle to get landowners and or the county even to keep those trees, because usually I think landowners see the trees as an adjacent nuisance and they're probably happy to see them bulldozed and gone because now they can crop right up to the roads. So, and I think a big part of that goes back to the point I made that because we don't have a value on those forests, those boundary systems, as long as we continue to see them as a nuisance, there's going to be pressure to get rid of them because it means that farmers are going to gain 1 or 2 meters at the edge of each field up to the road. And that would contrast with areas, for example, in Europe, where if you have a boundary system, I'm quite certain in areas in Germany and France, for example, you can't actually just go out and knock those trees down. That's not how it works. You would actually have to get approval and a permit because they are recognized for the value that they're bringing to these systems. And a first step would be to attach a dollar value and maybe, encourage landowners to retain those systems rather than getting rid of them. We're probably a long ways off from not allowing that to occur, but I think a first step would be to put a carrot out there for people to keep them. So hopefully that answers your question, Brenda.
And I guess the value is not only for carbon and greenhouse gas emissions reduction. There are a range of other values as well.
I think Brenda Brenda, you there? Okay, I thought I'd heard. Okay.
Oh, sorry, that was me, Ed.
Oh, okay.
I was going to respond to Sheila. I hope I'm saying the name right. So she had mentioned also looking at, so we had talked about the rates of biochar and manure treatment. And she also mentioned the type and method of biochar treatment, and absolutely 100% correct there. So the type of feedstock that we use for our biochar is very important and can cause different results. And also the way that we produce that biochar. So what temperature we produce it at, and other factors that go into producing that biochar can actually cause different effects when we apply this to the soil. So that is also fairly specific. And one of the things we wanted to do here was to compare that manure compost precursor with its biochar, with the biochar produced from it. But we can maybe hopefully be able to extrapolate that with more research into whether this is consistent across feedstocks. But with different feedstocks for the biochar and different production manners, we would probably have different outcomes and results.
So Cole, there's a question here from May. How much carbon is used to create biochar, and how does it compare to carbon sequestration benefit? So that's an interesting question from the life cycle perspective, right?
Yes.
You want to comment on that?
Well, the life cycle analysis is something that should absolutely be done, and that would actually start with the production of the manure and actually the composting process of that manure before we even got to producing the biochar. So there are many steps that go into this. One of the things we can look at is that that manure is a waste in the first place. So having a way to utilize that and having a way to utilize it and add it to the soil where it actually can be retained in the soil and not increase greenhouse gases is what we're really trying to achieve here and appear to have been able to achieve with this biochar rather than applying the manure compost. But we certainly do need to take into account a full life cycle analysis to understand the total net benefit in terms of the carbon cycle. You'll be losing carbon and releasing greenhouse gas emissions during the composting process, especially. And then during having to ship that manure compost to a place potentially that can produce the biochar at large rates, all of that, and then putting it back on the field. So all of that is actually causing greenhouse gas emissions, and it should be taken into effect. But ultimately, if we can get a long-term and ongoing benefits to the soil and carbon sequestration from this original stock of manure that's produced anyway on the field and within agriculture, our hope would be a net benefit to carbon sequestration.
And I guess I'll quickly add to that is that in every step, there's opportunities for optimization, right? Even with the manure, with the biochar production, it's very much related to the water content in the biochar, in the feedstock. If you have really high water content in the feedstock, you're going to be wasting a lot of energy by evaporating the water from the feedstock first.
Do you want me to keep reading off these questions, Scott? Because there are more. Sure. There was a question about whether anyone is doing anything to reduce nitrous oxide loss from fertilizer application in cropland.
And with our results with nitrous oxide, so there was certainly a substantial flux of nitrous oxide in the month for about a month following the inorganic fertilizer application with seeding. However, overall, in the specific sites that we studied, nitrous oxide played a very, very minor role in total greenhouse gas emissions. However, this flux after fertilization is still important to consider, and it's more important and substantial in other systems as well as there's a flux typically after a spring thaw. So we did not specifically look at, in this study, trying to reduce nitrous oxide emissions from the fertilizer, and there wasn't, from the inorganic fertilizer added by the farmers and landowners, and there wasn't an interaction. There was no effect of the treatments that we applied on nitrous oxide emissions. But however, nitrous oxide is a very important greenhouse gas emission from soils that's studied substantially in both in our lab and in other labs as well. So it's not something that's understudied, but it was not our focus of this project.
I'll really quickly add to that nitrous oxide question as well. As Cole mentioned, that in our lab, we have been studying the impact of biochar application on nitrous oxide emissions. We typically find biochar to be useful for reducing nitrous oxide emissions, but I guess Cole's data is still being analyzed, and so nothing is final yet. Seems like from this project, we didn't see a significant impact of biochar application in reducing nitrous oxide emissions. We are doing another project at the Breton plots. Prem is doing that part of the project. I don't know whether Prem you have done any analysis. Have you find any effect of the biochar on nitrous oxide emissions?
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, we have been trying to look at the nitrous oxide effect of biochar and manure. Biochar, I have not been able to analyze all the data from 2020, but from 2019 data, I have got reduction in N2 emission by biochar application as compared to manure, compost, and control.
Okay, so at the Breton plot study, we didn't see some reduction in the nitrous oxide emission coming from the biochar application. Biochar typically has an effect on suppressing nitrous oxide emissions.
And I think, sorry, go ahead, Pam.
In addition to that, we have been using another treatment also to help mitigate nitrous oxide from chemical fertilizer we use in the cropland. That's nitropurine. We have been testing nitropurine in addition to manure, compost, and biochar also.
So that's a nitrification inhibitor.
Yeah.
And then I'll add as well that the way that Prem's experiment is set up is very specific to be able to look at this effect of biochar on nitrous oxide emissions. Whereas one of the reasons we probably did not get an effect in our study is because, again, of this high variation, because we're looking at 10 different sites, whereas Prem is working on a single site to look at these applications. So he's able to control for that variability that we did not in our study. So that could help explain the differences there, and that we didn't see an effect of biochar on nitrous oxide inhibition.
Okay, other questions?
Reading questions?
Yeah.
So there was another question, Cole, about can you speak to the higher emissions from perennial vegetation relative to cropland, specifically the 62% higher rate in 2019? And I assume it has to do with the autotrophic versus heterotrophic that you discussed.
Yes, I do believe that is a part of it. So far, those results reported include both heterotrophic and autotrophic respiration. So it includes carbon dioxide emitted by roots, as well as carbon dioxide emitted by the respiration of microorganisms decomposing soil organic carbon. It's the respiration of microorganisms decomposing soil organic carbon that we are interested in. So once we remove the autotrophic respiration from those daily greenhouse gas emissions, we will likely see at least a closer results where maybe there won't be a significant difference at that point between the perennial vegetation and the cropland in terms of the perennial vegetation having greater greenhouse gas emissions. I think this is also related to, so I haven't had a chance yet to look at the interplay of all of our different data and all of these different variables that are interplaying here in greenhouse gas emissions and soil carbon dynamics. But one of them is certainly moisture content. And 2019 was just a very wet year. So we have had flooding on some of our sites, and this flooding tends to occur in the perennial areas. So sometimes these perennial areas, especially in the hedgerows where we do see that increase, the perennial vegetation might have been left in these hedgerow buffers because it's at a slightly lower elevation or in a slight area where you will have this accumulation of water, and it's not very good for using as cropland. So there are other dynamics here at play, and it's not necessary. It's more of a site-specific effect rather than necessarily a treatment effect. So hopefully, once we're able to look at all of these results together, we will be able to more understand why we do have this increase in greenhouse gas emissions in the perennial vegetation, whereas phase 1 of this study showed the exact opposite in terms of heterotrophic respiration.
Thanks, Cole. There's one other question about, just to clarify, was the biochar produced from manure or manure compost? And was the manure itself, I guess, manure or manure compost?
The manure was manure compost. So it was composted, it was steer manure, and it was composted with, it was mixed with the hay and straw in the beds of those steers. It was composted out in the elements in Saskatchewan, I believe Saskatchewan, over a year in a very large pile. And then we received that manure compost, and that was turned into biochar at 650 degrees Celsius for 90 minutes at low or no oxygen.
Great.
There was a question for Ed, for you.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. The question was, please explain what competition for nutrients under agroforestry systems would be. So there's two ways of looking at this. One is the competition that happens between the overstory and the understory. And obviously there's lots of evidence out there from the forestry literature, from the ecology literature. I've published work from Kinsella and other places to look at this intricate interaction that happens with the overstory and the understory. So there's clearly a lot of competition that happens in that regard. When we think about the system itself, there's this question about, well, what impact are the trees having on the adjacent herbaceous community? And very clearly there is going to be competition. Now it's going to be a gradient that's going to be much higher, very close to the margin of where those either boundary systems, so hedgerows or shelter belts are, or in the case of a silvopastoral system, if you've got this intricate patchwork mosaic of trees, you're going to have more intense competition around the perimeter than you will further away. So, and that's really going to depend on a lot of different things. What are the types of trees? What's the canopy of the trees? What kind of leaf litter is being deposited? How far away is that leaf litter being deposited? How far, and what's the configuration of the roots laterally? So there's going to be competition for water and nutrients. So there's absolutely going to be competition. What we did not quantify here is the gradients in that competitive zone between the forest system, especially the boundary system, and the adjacent herbaceous community. That was not the intent. So we basically went a far enough distance out into the adjacent either cropland or perennial grassland, and then looked at what the soil conditions were, what the different greenhouse gas dynamics and what the microbial properties were, and so on. So we basically considered the agroforestry system to be the merger, the spatial merger of those two, but we didn't look at that specific competitive relationship. That's a whole separate set of questions, which absolutely should be studied for two reasons. One, that the degree of competition is often, I think, what's cited and used by under the logic of producers, farmers in particular, crop farmers, to say, I want to get rid of those boundary trees because they're having an impact on things like the performance of my crop in the first 2 meters or 5 meters or 10 meters. So until we actually quantify that, then we're not going to be in as good a position to be able to say, this is the net benefit or trade-off of having the trees to store carbon and reduce greenhouse gas footprint, as opposed to what we're losing on the crop side. The other impetus, I would argue, is it makes it even more important to put a dollar value on the trees themselves and to reward landowners for retaining and conserving those trees. Because using the logic I just laid out for you and the potential for competition, right now, those trees are being perceived as a competitor. And if someone comes along like the county and says, I'll back slope the ditch and I'll get rid of the trees for you, most landowners will go, thank you very much. You're getting rid of my competition. So I think that is the argument that many landowners are probably using, and the de facto point that they're not making money off those trees, ergo they're a liability. Let's get rid of them wherever we can. So yes, it's a very good question on the competition, and it would require a whole nother set of studies to figure out how far into the field does that competition go? How does it vary by tree species, by forest age, and so on? I know those studies have been done elsewhere in the world, but I don't know how many studies have done that specifically under kind of the conditions that we have here in central Alberta, central Saskatchewan. Scott, maybe you can speak to it.
Well, I don't think I have too much to add to that.
Okay.
Well, as I fully agree with you that that is an important question to be studied, but I guess it's holds a lot of different questions.
If I can, unless Ed, you had more on that, there was an important point from May I'd like to address.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so May had said, comparing the life cycle of just manure compost versus manure compost made into biochar, making biochar seems like a bother. And so I would actually, this is very important because as of now, without this being incentivized, without, I guess, this coming on board in terms of this being an incentivized agricultural practice, it is actually a complete bother to make biochar on a mass basis right now. So it's very difficult to be able to find a facility that would produce this biochar for us from manure compost, particularly because manure compost contains more moisture, as Scott was mentioning. And the current systems that produce biochar are not set up to deal with that. They're not set up to deal with the sizes of the manure compost, and they're not set up to deal with that moisture content. So it was very difficult, and even this facility that actually did it for us, that took a lot of work to find somebody to do it and for them to agree, and they were kind enough to do it. They actually had to shut down production for an entire week to be able to produce this biochar for us. So it's certainly not optimized right now. Again, as Scott was talking about, there's availability to optimize all of these procedures. And if this is encouraged more, if this is incentivized, then hopefully we can have better ways to produce this biochar on a mass basis. Because as we do see here, applying the manure compost in our study to the soil both increased greenhouse gas emissions and didn't increase soil organic carbon. So in terms of what to apply, the biochar, it's no question as to whether it was better to apply the biochar versus the manure compost. So what we need to do is have a way to optimize that production of the biochar from a waste product like manure or manure compost.
Excellent. Thank you, Cole. I think there is another question from Chris Ledigo. From your studies so far, which agroforestry system can you say is the best for carbon sequestration? I would say that there isn't a whole lot of difference among the 3 different agroforestry systems. But based on the results so far, I would say the silvopasture system seems to be the best. It's much more effective in sequestering carbon. But you might have, or Cam, you might have others to add to that.
I would agree with that. I think there's a number of reasons probably for it. One, it's already there. So you're not starting from scratch. The other one is if you think back to what Cam presented, they are multi-species. So they have not only different plant species, shrub species, tree species, but they're multi-tiered, they're functioning when we think of those key ecosystem processes of solar energy capture and conversion, nutrient cycling and hydrologic function, anytime you've got those multi-tiers and high species diversity, that's going to be better able to colonize the soil and provide root inputs and so on. So I think there's a lot of signals that are suggesting that those silvopasture systems, together with the natural hedgerows, ironically, are actually quite proficient, much more proficient than we might have thought before we started this study in actually storing carbon. And yes, the shelter belts store a lot of carbon as well, but a lot of that is in the above ground biomass. A lot of it is in the above ground biomass. And so that's something to keep in the back of your mind, that if someone goes and cuts down those trees, that a lot of that carbon is gone, depending on what they do with the trees.
So just in the phase 2 of the project, we didn't actually look at silvopasture. So we looked at hedgerow and shelter belts. And in terms of which one is better, I think what has already been discussed is also what we're finding. But I would also add that the hedgerow sites were much more variable. So in general, they did hold more organic carbon, and some of the systems held extremely high soil organic carbon. But I think the hedgerow is more variable because, again, it's kind of this site specific. Was there a reason that those hedgerows were left in these systems? Do they not support plant growth very well? Are they on a slight incline? So I think that there are some site specific considerations that don't really come into play with shelter belts, where you had basically flat cropland that then you had the trees planted. So I think you have slightly different dynamics in that way, but certainly there was overall greater organic carbon in the hedgerow, just as a mean in the soil, but it's more variable than the shelter belts.
So
Yeah,
I think the
that's
key,
another thing working against the silvopastures, because by and large you find silvopastures on areas that maybe have some kind of soil limitation to begin with. Because if it's really high quality, black chernozemic soil, loamy soil, in all likelihood, it's been converted into cropland at some point in the past. So, and we did find that, I believe, I'm quite sure the silvopasture areas were generally a little bit sandier in terms of texture. And so they're working at a disadvantage from the get-go. And despite that, they still had an equivalent amount of carbon, which is really interesting. So they're on poor quality ecosites, but they're still. So imagine what we've lost because we no longer have silvopastures on the better quality loamy soils. We don't know that because they're gone.
right. So I think in a sense, we need to have a diversification in terms of the different agroforestry systems that we practice as well, right? It's not going to be one system that's going to fit all. There was another question for Cam. Are the 69% of carbon stored in is soil disproportionately distributed over the effective root zone?
Yeah, if that's just, there's more carbon stored in the upper layers of the soil. I think that's what that question is asking, where there's more organic material. And so it is, yeah, it's disproportionate. There's more towards the top layer and less as you get deeper down.
Okay, and there is a comment from May. Silvopasture, as you described it, Edward, has a built-in buffer for forage production in dry versus wet years.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the benefits to having these forested, this mixed mosaic of forests and grasslands, is during really dry years, your grasslands may start to senesce and shut down and decline in forage quality in, let's say, late July or August, whereas the understory of these forests actually stay green. And so, you know, that we've published work on this. I had a PhD student, George Powell, who actually published some papers explaining why that occurs, because the relative humidity actually stays higher in the understory of these aspen stands, which keeps the understory growing longer, ironically, even during drought periods. So absolutely, I agree with you, May. I think that's a really good point. It's one that producers who have those forests are aware of. But again, not all of them may understand it, you know, why it's happening, but many of them do understand that it's there and it's important.
I would add to the discussion with the hedgerow versus shelter belt again, and kind of going back to the multi-species that was talked about being able to increase carbon sequestration and the architecture of roots below ground as well, and the optimization of that space below ground, and then kind of where is the soil? Is it in that rooting zone or deeper? In the hedgerows, especially at our sites, we found that in some cases, and this is where some of the variability came into play, in some cases there was extensive amounts of actually greater organic carbon concentration, even at 30 to 50 centimeters in depth. So again, this is kind of playing along with that, the role of these multi-species and the architecture of the roots below ground, increasing the carbon below ground. And then especially, even though you have this, in general, a decrease of organic carbon concentration as you go deeper in the soil, because there's more soil mass, there's actually greater organic carbon deeper in the soil, which is why in the cropland we had an increase in soil organic carbon in mass in the surface, but that was counteracted and offset by a slight loss in the deeper soil.
Okay, there's a question about for the funding. Right now, we don't have new funding for continuing this program, but I guess we obviously could be looking for new funding. There's the Living Labs initiative that's been discussed in, so this is a new funding initiative, but unfortunately, universities cannot apply for that, or we cannot be the lead organization for these grants. So we'll be looking into those as well. There's potential opportunity to collaborate whoever is a leading organization to establish a living lab in Alberta. There's a comment from Sheila, agree that poor quality marginal lands are a good target for optimizing agroforestry systems. Thank you for that comment, Sheila. Are there any other questions? We are about 10 minutes over our schedule. Any other questions?
I wonder if Chris is still with us, if he would maybe want to speak a little bit to the biochar types and what he's found, since that was one of the questions, and the feedstocks and how that production makes a difference for how the biochar interplays in the soil.
Oh, thank you so much, Cole, for the opportunity. I am glad to listen to every one of you. Yeah, so specifically to what you've asked, yeah, biochar is a very diverse product, in the sense that once you change the feedstock type, you change the production conditions, you're going to change significantly the properties of the biochar. So again, you use manure, compost. If you try to use something else, like in our own study, we are studying about 4 different types of feedstocks, and we are finding that canola straw, because for me, I'm working on water remediation. So canola straw happens to be the best for us in terms of absorption. And even with canola straw, we are finding that those produced at high temperature, like 500 to 700 degrees Celsius, they are the ones that are working better in terms of contaminant removal as compared to low temperature. Then also, we are looking at different production methods. We use conventional method, we use microwave pyrolysis method, and these methods also they affect the properties of the biochar. So it's good, like what Dr. Chang said, it's good to optimize. So, but I don't think that is the focus of this project. But if you maybe once you get what you're looking for, another step would be to optimize, get the which biochar will work best for carbon sequestration. Thank you very much.
Chris, one follow-up. So why was the canola straw better at absorption? So what made it?
Can I suggest that we leave that discussion to after the meeting?
Okay, I thought it might be interesting because of the the question about that.
Right, we are 10 minutes after or beyond the schedule, and we are losing participants. But I would like to make a last call for questions from the audience. Are there any other questions?
I actually have a question, if I shall, I'm going to ask it.
What's that again?
So there were a lot of variations in course data. So I was wondering how difficult is it to manage variation? Because I know because you're working in the field, so the variation you cannot control it, but like you see the error bars so long. So how does that affect research of this nature? And how are you able to manage it compared to some of us that work in the lab? We don't see that much variation. Then how should your conclusions be taken in the light of variations? Thank you.
Yeah, there was a great deal of variation, both because of differences annually with precipitation, especially was incredibly variable over the years, and a lot of precipitation in 2019 and 2020. But then just having these 10 different sites in different areas. So one of the ways that we controlled this was by having a split plot design where we did have the treatments together at a single site, so that everything was equivalent between them in that sense. So that helped us to control for some of this variation, but then of course we still have these 10 different sites. So we have just the variation between those sites. And so this did add to our variation, and it does reduce our ability to be able to see differences in the means. But ultimately, in some sense, this is really great when we actually do get differences that are found as being significant because of this, because we've looked at different sites around central Alberta that have different soil textures, that have different, these two different systems. So we are actually able to get a more robust answer in that sense when we do actually are able to see differences in the means. So ideally we would have more sites, but it is a huge challenge. It's a lot of work having sites all over central Alberta, and then just the landowners and farmers who they do sacrifice to work with us, and they're absolutely amazing. But it as Ed was saying, they have to work with us a lot, and they have to avoid our equipment on their land, and so it's difficult for them. So ideally we'd have more sites, but and that would help to be able to see these differences. But in this case, I think we still got some fairly robust results.
Great. So I guess I'm adjourning this workshop. For the presenters, can you stay on? For the attendants, I thank you for attending this workshop. And Prem, I apologize for putting you on the spot, but thank you for your contribution about the nitrous oxide question.